Welcome. Hi. I want to say hi to everyone in the room here in Ottawa. Thank you for coming out. I know it's fun to get together. And I want to say welcome to everybody who's joining us online on Zoom. My name is Jennifer Ditchburn. I'm President and CEO of the IRPP. It's a great pleasure to have you with us today. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the unceded and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, whose members we recognize as custodians of these lands and waters since time immemorial. And this land has been a gathering place for many Indigenous peoples. We honor their enduring connection to this land. In our work as a think tank researching public policy, we have to acknowledge that different policies and regulations and laws over the centuries, or a few centuries, have done great harm to Indigenous people. And actually on the topic that we're discussing today, which is on the digital divide in Canada, it's also important to acknowledge that probably the biggest group that suffers from the digital divide in Canada are Indigenous people. So thank you again for being with us today. I want to present our panel of esteemed panelists. To my immediate right is Bill Murdoch, Executive Director of Clear Sky Connections, a not-for-profit corporation mandated by the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs to connect First Nation communities with fiber. He's Vice Chair of the First Mile Connectivity Consortium and volunteers with many organizations to advance connectivity for Indigenous communities. And Bill, you said you've been working on this for about 11 years, right?
Roughly about 11 years.
That's a long time. Alicia Ram, hello, was appointed Senior Assistant Deputy Minister of Employment and Social Development Canada's Income Security and Social Development Branch and Policy Horizons Canada. Love Policy Horizons. In 2023. Alicia's been working in the public service of Canada for over 25 years. He joined ESDC in 2018, where he served as Associate Assistant Deputy Minister of the Skills and Employment Branch, and then as AADM of the Strategic and Service Policy Branch. You thought there were long acronyms in Indigenous organizations, but the federal government gives it.
Anything on a federal government when it comes to alphabet soup. That's right, yeah.
And to my far right, Ian Scott has over 25 years of policy and regulatory experience in broadcasting and telecom, both in the public and private sectors. Most recently, he served as the chairperson and chief executive officer of the CRTC. Ian was appointed to the position in 2017 and led the commission from then to January 2023. Welcome to you all. So when I was coming over here today, I was reflecting on the fact that we can really take for granted how easy it is to have a hybrid event like this, that we have the capacity to have a few hundred people online, people in the room, we can go work remotely, I can go work in one of several offices, my Montreal office, Ottawa office, I can work from home, and how easy it is to connect. And I think we're really insulated from the fact that there is still a sizable group of people in Canada that do not have reliable, affordable access to high-speed internet. I'll just give you some statistics. The federal government has set a goal of connecting 98% of Canadians to high-speed internet by 2026 and 100% by 2030, and about $8 billion has been dedicated so far to this goal. But as of the end of 2022, so not very long ago, half of households in First Nations communities and 58% of households in Northern Canada did not meet the basic service target. And at the end of 2022, not one of Nunavut's communities had what was considered high-speed internet. So Ian, I'm going to start with you first. And you published a study with the IRPP at the beginning of the summer, which I recommend reading. It's a good read. You talk about the gaps that still remain for getting high-speed internet across the country. So the overarching numbers look good when we're talking in the 90s in terms of deployment. But who is still living with broadband, and what do you think some of the hurdles have been to getting them service?
It's such a big question. You've summarized very well the kind of glass half full, glass half empty situation I think we find ourselves in. The government committed to get to roughly 92%, and they reached that. It's a little over 93, perhaps by now approaching 94%. Nationally, it's about 1.1 million households that do not have 5010. I'll come back to that in a second. When I say 5010, for those who aren't familiar, talking about the download speed would be 50 megahertz and the upload 10. That was an aspirational target established by the CRTC way back in 2016, beginning of 2017, and the government adopted it. It's a functional, you can do almost everything with 5010. We discovered during COVID, you can't have multiple conference calls or video calls along with digital homework and perhaps gaming all at once. But the reality is 5010 is a basic target. Again, I'll come back to that. So most households have it. The glass half empty is very obvious. You just pointed out the big numbers. And the most troublesome one is 50% of Indigenous communities don't have 5010. So that is a major societal problem. Those are individuals and communities are probably those most in need. There are some of those that face some of the harshest or most considerable socioeconomic challenges. So there's a lot of work to be done. Now, that said, one has to give credit to governments, civil society, the carriers. When I started at the commission, that number was 24% in Indigenous communities. And it's doubled nationally. And Bill, I'm sure, is going to point out that parts of Canada and Manitoba and Saskatchewan are particularly notable among the provinces, have not, increased that much. But the work is underway and money is being committed. It does take a long time to build out, particularly to remote areas. Last thing I'll just point out is the most challenging part of Canada is Nunavut. Nunavut has, if you don't know, no road access. Anyway, it is only accessible by sea or by air. There are, I'm going to test my memory, I believe it is still 23 satellite-dependent communities in Nunavut. None of them are in the process of getting 5010, but traditionally they've had much less, 5 or 10 megabits, which is not a functional level. Mm-hmm. The commission recently granted a broadband award to the government of Nunavut to build an undersea fiber, which will help. It'll connect to Iqaluit, the largest community, and 3 others. But it's a major, major problem. Last point I'll make is that 1 million or 1.1 million households are going to be difficult to reach.
What is is it a terrestrial, like, is the main challenge terrestrial in terms of the actual construction, or is there more nuance there in terms of why?
Combination of things. I mean, if you think of it from a business planning perspective, the North, generally defined, has about 137,000 people, about the population of something like Sherbrooke, Quebec. Not a smallish city, and it's 2/3 of Canada's landmass. So I mean, that's the first dimension of the problem. It's not simple to address. It is not easy to run fiber to the far north. You are talking about going over, thousands of kilometers of terrain, where there are no roads, no rail beds. It's difficult. Satellite provides backhaul at the moment and may provide solutions in the future. The other point I'd make is one of the reasons for the relatively slow deployment in the most rural area is also necessary skills and labor. We have a shortage. so does the United States, of people who can install that fiber. And that hasn't gotten any better, with COVID and post-COVID.
Bill, earlier, before this began, we were talking about the distance between, say, Winnipeg and Nelson House. So you said about 12 hours.
It's about a 12-hour drive. So 100 kilometers an hour on the highway nonstop, and 12 hours later, you'll be in Nelson House.
So for a community like Nelson House or others that are remote, give us the lay of the land of how difficult it is to connect to fiber and what people are struggling with there.
Difficulty connecting. Well, there's in Manitoba. There's actually an extensive fiber network that Manitoba Hydro built to connect their hydro dams to manage their hydro facilities. They set up Manitoba Hydro Telecom. They realized they had excess capacity on the hydro network, so they created All Hydro Telecom to wholesale it to other ISPs. The Clear Sky project, we worked in partnership with Hydro to design a fiber network to connect all 63 First Nation communities in Manitoba. Our plan is to connect from the point of presence or a main distribution point in each community to the existing hydro, and then use hydro for transit back to Winnipeg to connect to the internet. These distances are, as you mentioned, 12 hours to get to Nelson House. The Nelson House build was roughly 80-kilometer fiber build along existing right-of-way. It took a couple of years to just get the approvals, the permits, the funding in place. But once the construction starts, I mean, they can average about 5 kilometers a day. It's just getting to the point of cash in the bank, the contracts in place, permitting, environmental if it's required, to just simply do the work, and then we run the fiber. So the difficulty would be the getting up to the point of construction. And then when you have construction, the build season's actually quite short. It's June till the end of October, early November. And that has to do with the weather. So you need perfect weather. Has to be a dry spring. The reason for June is because the ground's still frozen at depth, so by June it thaws out enough so that we can bury the fiber. And the reason we bury it is to, protect it. It has a longer life than hanging it on a pole. So the technical challenges are not insurmountable. It's more the money to do the initial build is where the most difficult part is.
You wrote a very good piece a couple weeks ago in Policy Options with two other authors about some of the tough choices people have to make in terms of affordability of internet service. So one part is getting access to the line, but then there's once you have it, dealing with the cost of it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So the Clear Sky project started about 12 years ago. I've been with the project for about 11 years. During that time, we did a feasibility study, and we did additional work. It was actually about $4 million worth of planning, the technical, legal, and financial plan. So the estimated life of fiber in the ground is about 40 years. So we've shown with a 70% subscription model, we can replace the fiber at the end of life, as well as do break fix during the interim. That's for fiber with unlimited access. A lot of the current backhaul is wireless to connect these communities. Specifically talking just terrestrial wireless. So with terrestrial wireless, the subscription model, they have overage fees built in. So say you get a 10 gig plan or a 50 gig plan. Once you go over that limit, then you have to pay additional charges. And I have yet anybody to tell me why there's additional charges other than managing the usage on the wireless network. Because I know for the transit, it's unlimited usage, the gateway's unlimited usage. The only time these usage limits come into play is when it's terrestrial backhaul, wireless terrestrial backhaul. So people that are in the north on a connection that's not fiber-based, there's additional fees and charge. In some communities, I've heard of people purchasing 2 internet connections just because of the overage. So they use the limit on one and then they switch over to the other.
Alicia, in terms of overall affordability and poverty issues that you and your colleagues are looking at ESDC, can you give us an idea of what the picture is right now for Canadians?
Sure, and by the way, thank you for having me on the panel. I feel woefully inadequate between these experts, but I'll do what I can. So one of the issues with statistics and information about poverty, it's always backward looking, right? I mean, we rely on income tax data as well as Statistics Canada surveys by and large, and those always come with a lag. So kind of the best information that we have at the moment is based on 2022 data, so not up to the minute. What we do see is that kind of within the current framework of looking at poverty, which is the National Poverty Strategy, we see sort of a consistent decline in various metrics related to poverty between 2015 and 2019, which has a lot to do both with the economy having been pretty strong during those years, but also increasing government transfers. So the Canada Child Benefit came in around that time. The government increased the guaranteed income supplement, which is targeting low-income seniors. There were investments in housing. So, you know, there were forces that were driving kind of that poverty rate down. Then we get into 2020, so pandemic, and counterintuitively, we see metrics related to poverty drop significantly. Why is that? Again, government transfers. So we had a variety of pandemic-related benefits, many of them delivered by my department, not all, and those by necessity were not as carefully targeted to income as some of the other programs tend to be. For example, the emergency response benefit, flat $2,000 a month, you know, whether you were in my income bracket or somebody who's just barely making a living, right? So it was a great safety net. It kind of prevented, I think, much more long-term economic and social damage, but it got us to poverty rates that were not sustainable. And that's what we see sort of as we get into 2021, 2022. Government transfers go back to where they've always been, while at the same time, the economy still was sort of limping along, recovering from the pandemic. And we saw the impact of high inflation rates that we've been used to over the last few decades. And of course, many government programs are geared to inflation, but it's always after the fact. So inflation happens, and then we catch up. So kind of what we're seeing is across most measures of poverty, both the headline poverty rate, as well as things like food insecurity, attachment to the labor market, unmet housing needs, health needs. Those metrics are up from where they were in 2020. They're approximately where they were in 2019. So we haven't slid all the way back to where we started, but we also really haven't made significant improvements over the last 5 years. The other thing that we know, of course, is that poverty is not monolithic. There are significant intersectional elements that are built into it. So people from racialized backgrounds tend to experience poverty more severely than the average. Families with children, about the average. But again, within that, there's going to be a lot of variability depending on your background. We talked about Indigenous communities and people of Indigenous descent. They tend to experience poverty at much higher rate, almost double the national average, which is a huge problem. And similarly, persons with disabilities tend to experience poverty more strongly, typically because they have a much weaker attachment to the labor force.
Thank you. Well, thank you, the three of you, for giving us a picture, because they're all interrelated, and there's really three overlapping topics that we have on the table. So one is access to internet, one is affordability, and then there's a third, which is the ability to use technological tools. The OECD has a program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, which measures the ability to use digital technology and networks and communication tools. And the proportion of Canadians who scored in the lowest rung of that assessment was higher than the OECD average. So there is an issue also around the ability to make use of these tools once you have them. So Alicia, I'm just going to stay with you. What can you tell us about the federal government's approach to addressing that particular challenge? What do you have in your toolbox that could address digital literacy? And
Yeah, so the way we tend to think about digital literacy, it's something that we put in the bucket of transferable skills, in the sense that once you have that skill, it becomes like a gateway to other things, right? And so we have a partnership with the provinces and territories when it comes to kind of labor market training. That's a responsibility that was delegated to the provinces in the 90s. Our department still transfers a significant amount of money every year to the provinces to support that effort, and digital skills is a component of that. Now, of course, each province and territory has a lot of flexibility in terms of how they use the resources that we transfer to them. But we do expect them to share their plans with us, and we do have an active conversation with them about how we are supporting not just sort of targeted skills like a job skill, but also how do we support literacy, including digital literacy, so that people aren't simply necessarily locked into that one thing we taught them, but also can have skills that they can use when things change. Jobs are always evolving, skills are always evolving, and if you have those transferable skills, then you can adapt along with it rather than having to come back to governments or to another source and saying, teach me something else. We also have some smaller but more targeted programs. For example, we have a program called Skills for Success, which is very much focused on people with very, very low literacy skills. And literacy is broadly defined and includes digital. And so we are, in fact, working largely through third-party organizations to identify those individuals with those kind of below average skills, and then get them into the training solution that is actually going to get them to a level where they can then kind of move into something that's more mainstream. The last thing I'll say about this is that usage isn't just about skills, it's also about accessibility. And so one of the things that my area of ESDC worries about is the extent to which individuals with disabilities are actually able to consume the technology and participate sort of in that endeavor. And so we and our partners are working on different ways in which we can ensure that the technology that as it rolls out, including legacy, can become more accessible over time. The goal is a barrier-free Canada by 2040. And so, for example, Accessibility Standards Canada recently published a new standard on the use of ICTs. The standard, of course, voluntary, not mandatory, but it gives you a nice baseline that people can kind of look to, which is also consistent with international practices. And so that as people are rolling out new technologies, they can kind of make sure that that accessibility is built in at the front end rather than has to be retrofitted later.
thank you. And I wanted to just shout out to Christine Pinson-Johnson, who is here and who co-authored a very good paper with Matthias Sturm for the IRPP, which we published last week. I always get my dates wrong. We're about 10 days ago, on digital literacy and an adult education system in Canada. So it's, I think, many different layers to addressing some of those gaps. I want to come back to the accessibility issue, Bill. Talk to us about some of the challenges with how the federal and provincial funding flows to support some of the connectivity projects. So you said in a prior conversation that we had that the funding really favors end-to-end solutions. Can you explain what that means and how that's an obstacle?
I know to back up a little bit there, so there was an earlier funding pot that only included last mile builds. So we could build in the community, but there's nothing to connect to. The problem is there's no transit, so there's no point in applying for that fund because we weren't able to light it up or connect it. There was another funding application that came through where they wanted, it was a 1 month window, but in the application they wanted the permitting as part of the application. Well, the permits for the north take 6 weeks, so we'd have the permits 2 weeks after the application deadline. So for the end-to-end funding, so there's three. I always advocate for this. There's 3 separate businesses, the big businesses when connecting to the internet, since the focus is with the internet. You have the gateway, so that's the connection from the major urban center to the global internet. In the case of Manitoba, that would be Winnipeg. Then you have transit, or transport, or backhaul, whichever word you want to use. That's the connection from the gateway to the community. That's where Clear Sky fits. And then you have the distribution. That's the connection from your point of presence or your main distribution point in the community to all your customers. So the three business pieces, one would be gateway. So there's lots of established gateways out there. You can Google, gateways. There's lots of them. The transit is the difficult piece because a lot of it doesn't exist to connect First Nation communities. And then the last piece is the part that connects the customers. So that would be the internet service provider. So that's the three separate business pieces. The funding model wants an end-to-end solution from global internet to the customer. Well, if you have a community of, say, 200 homes, it doesn't make sense to have multiple internet service providers challenge each other to connect that small community. There's no business case. It doesn't make any sense. And if all the funding goes to one service provider to connect that community, then that locks in the community to that vendor. It creates a monopoly, essentially. By separating it out, having three separate businesses, so you have the gateway, whoever you want to use, you have the transit, and the transit could be open access. Clear Sky is not for profit, so everything's transparent. We're audited every year. Everybody would pay the same pricing. And then you have the internet service provider, which we work with the First Nation communities to determine how they want to provide that service. So that's the three separate business pieces. And the service is not limited to internet service because we're using fiber. You could have, cell phone, EMR, television, radio, emergency communications. I mean, the list goes on. And that's all the service delivery part, which is separate from the transit, but all of those services require the transit. So the funding model, looking for an end-to-end solution.
And is the funding, when we're talking about the funding model, is it for federal funds, provincial funds, or both? Are they still sort of stuck on this end-to-end vision?
They're, in general, both. The big one right now is the Universal Broadband Fund. So the UBF is looking for an end-to-end solution. Other funds in the past have, like I said, earlier one was just for last mile piece. There's the big one being the UBF. So they're looking for an end-to-end solution.
Which is administered through ISED.
Yeah. And in the case of Manitoba, there's 63 First Nation communities, 61 of them fall under federal jurisdiction. So when we look for funding to connect these communities with the province says, go to the feds, and then the feds say, well, what's the province kicking in? Go back to the province, and it's always back and forth.
Not efficient.
Not efficient. And different funding models, different funding pots require different applications, so you got to tailor the application to the funding pot, even though the end solution is the same. And then you have the additional reporting requirements with each funding pot. And some expenses are eligible under one, they're not eligible under another, so then you have to manage the finances accordingly. And then there's some expense, in general, if there's a responsibility or a deliverable in providing the service, there should be a line item or a budget for that. In many cases, some of the fees are not included in the funding models. Example would be CPE equipment, customer premise equipment. Under the UBF fund, we can build a connection to the community, but there's no funds. The equipment that goes in people's homes to connect to the internet is not eligible under the UBF. So we can build to the community, but we can't connect the home. We'd have to source those funds elsewhere.
Thank you. On affordability, Ian, I want to touch on this with you. One interesting regional snapshot has found that 23% of adults in the Waterloo region of Ontario do not have an internet connection at home and rely on public Wi-Fi and on a local library's Wi-Fi hotspot loan program. I took that actually from Christine from your paper, I believe, as an interesting, just a little snapshot of one community in Canada where people are going to the library to use Wi-Fi because they can't afford to pay for it at home. You've noted that there's a framework in place for encouraging telecom providers to offer internet at lower rates, and there's also something called the Connecting Families Fund, which is overseen by ISED, and with internet service providers offers a heavily discounted rate for people at the lowest income brackets in Canada, but on a voluntary basis. But you make the point that there's a difference between price and affordability. Can you talk a little bit more about why that's an important distinction?
Well, it's an important distinction at a couple of levels. The government focus, let me take a step back. You just quite properly pointed out that adopting or connecting to the internet isn't only a question of it being available, it's being affordable, and you're sufficiently technically literate to use it. So those are the three things we're talking about. That's not unique to the most remote areas. This is equally true of suburban areas and urban areas. If you go to the area around Jane and Finch in Toronto, you're going to find a much lower level of connectivity, not because it's not available, because it's not affordable. But I think broadly speaking, the government focus has been on aggregate pricing. And so looking at international comparisons, saying, I think the average rate for overall in Canada is about $78. It's a little bit less in the US if you took exchange into account, not that different. But no one has been focused on looking at what price is affordable for those in low income or other communities with special needs and so on. The Auditor General in its last report on broadband actually pointed out that while we track deployment, we don't track connectivity. And that's true. So I think there's a sort of misplaced emphasis. And it goes right through kind of the public policy environment. Government quite properly has been encouraging the CRTC, who has regulatory responsibility, to do everything it can to get rates down, both in wireless and in broadband. And that is absolutely the Commission's job. But you're not going to lower aggregate rates to the point where they're affordable to low-income families. And there's a real disconnect there. And government needs, I think, in my view, to accept that they have a responsibility overall to look at that affordability issue in a realistic sense in terms of what price is affordable to those communities. And that hasn't been the case. It's been this aggregate look at through the regulatory perspective or lens. And that's not the CRTC's ultimate job. That's a broad government responsibility, and not just the federal government. It includes federal, provincial, territorial government. So there needs to be much more coordination, and there needs to be, in my view, a refocusing of what we're looking at when we track these statistics.
And you've talked about a program in the United States that actually provided a targeted benefit to low-income families, which has been actually eliminated, but at some point it was in the many millions of people that were connected.
I was actually, I pointed it out, and sadly, as you said, because of some partisan political differences, its funding was time limited, and they could not get sufficient congressional votes to continue it. In the period of time it was active, they extended service to over 15 million households. That's roughly the number of total households in Canada. And we have an outstanding connectivity issue or digital divide issue of a little over 1 million. So if you think about a focused government program, there's clear evidence that it can address the problem. And we should be looking at exactly that kind of program to deal with those on fixed income. By the way, in that US program, and I'll use the US term, US tribal lands, which is their terminology, and so no offense to those Indigenous peoples in Canada or elsewhere, had a $70 discount. If you took, and I'm sure Bill can speak to this, if you took $70 off the internet rates in Nunavut or remote communities, you'll be in affordable range. I mean, certainly it would make a massive difference to our connectivity statistics.
And so the way that it worked would be that you would receive some kind of discount on, and it would be done in
Yeah.
coordination with ISPs.
There are obviously different models. The US model was if you were eligible for any of a group of federal subsidized services, food stamps, which the name has changed, so I apologize, it's not the current name, lunch programs. There's a whole set of social programs that are supported by the US federal government. If you qualified for any of those, you qualified for the subsidy, and it was through the ISP.
Okay.
Ultimately. But you could do it in a number of ways. You could use tax credits, although that is something of a problem because not everyone, well, you would know this well, not those in lowest income and with educational or literacy challenges don't always file income tax or take advantage of tax credits. But there are a number of ways to do it. And there's clear evidence that it's a successful program.
So Alicia, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the preference in your department is for more of a neutral approach to getting at some of the issues with people who are in the low income brackets, I guess. Can you talk a little bit about that? There is nothing like what Ian is describing, but there are other programs.
For sure. And so one of the issues that you face when you're looking at any kind of broad approach to income support is that the headline statistics can tell you a lot about the situation of an average household, tell you almost nothing about the circumstances of any individual household you might be looking at. And so you can take two households that look identical, so 2 adults, 1.6 children, same overall economic level. Those two households are going to have potentially very, very different needs and preferences when you compare them to each other. So if we are going to want to provide them with income support, if we tie that income support to any individual use, be it transportation, food, internet, shelter, whatever it is, we are going to, unless we actually go in and evaluate each household's needs independently, we are going to overcompensate some and undercompensate others because their needs and preferences are not the same. They're not living in the same part of the country, they're facing different pricing structures. One household might have particularly high medical needs, the other one might not be able to afford a car, so there's all of these other things. So from the point of view of trying to maximize the overall well-being of the household, we'd rather just try to increase the overall level of income and let them sort out exactly how they want to spend that money. So that's one issue. Second issue is much more practical, and it has to do with what we euphemistically call integrity. If we are going to give somebody funding that is dedicated to a particular use, we have to have some ability to actually evaluate whether that use is being met. And so if we were to send everybody, I don't know, pick a number, $30 a month, and say this is for internet use, we would have to have some way to figure out that they're actually using it for that. And that very, very quickly becomes really intrusive. And administratively, honestly, for $30 a month, we would spend more than $30 trying to figure out what the money went for. Now, there is a tax system, and you mentioned that, Ian, and that system is more geared to that kind of thing because people are already filing, and there's some ability to ask them to submit receipts, maybe on a random basis or something. But as you said, part of the problem is that the people that we're most trying to help tend to be the people who file the least because they often don't have enough income to qualify for non-refundable tax credits, and they often don't have the literacy to even know that that's available to them. That doesn't mean that there can't be other mechanisms of trying to get at it, but from the point of view of kind of broad-based income support, that doesn't tend to be how we look at it.
Sorry, and you wanted to...
Just to add, and I understand that from a broad-based approach. The U.S. program, not to harp on the point, was administered by the Federal Communications Commission and was very focused, and money was specifically targeted, for that public policy issue. We could have done the same in Canada using auction revenues. That is many billions of dollars that have gone into consolidated revenue, serving many needs for all Canadians. but it equally could have been targeted, or a portion of it targeted to address an issue which is fundamentally important to the future of Canada, digital literacy and a digital economy.
Bill, did you want to add anything to that?
I was thinking about MedTrans. So it's reallocating existing funds. So in Manitoba, when I was working, this project started with the health portfolio about 12 years ago. How do we get more bandwidth to support electronic medical records? Scope expanded from more bandwidth to connecting communities with fiber, because it's the only viable option. When I was working with health 10, 12 years ago, medical transportation, if somebody in a First Nation community needs to go to hospital, at that time it was costing about $110 million a year for that transportation. I'm sure it's much, much higher today. Talking with one of the chiefs back then, if they had access to electronic medical records, telehealth, distance health tools, they said they could probably reduce their MedTrans by 80%. Now, say that's not a realistic number, that's pie in the sky thinking. Let's say it's 10%. So $110 million, 10%, $11 million a year. So if we take that $11 million a year and invest into connectivity, I would be sitting here telling you, this is what we did, as opposed to this is what we need. Like, our project would be done. Like, if I had $10 million a year starting 10 years ago, all the communities in Manitoba, all the First Nation communities would be connected. I'd be done. We had a 7-year plan.
I just want to let you know that there'll be time for questions online and in the room. But I wanted to make sure that we talked about solutions. And you've raised issues around coordination. Ian, definitely in your paper, you talk about the need for better coordination. So let's start with coordination inside the federal government. What do you think that you'd like to see there?
Sure. Look, increased coordination, or generally speaking, coordination among government departments and governments is obviously always a goal and an objective. But there are some institutional barriers here. The CRTC's fund is overseen by a quasi-judicial body. It can't share information beyond the public record. It can only rely on the public record, and so on. ISED's program has different criteria. They share some common data, but they're not interwoven. Then you have Infrastructure Canada, you have the Infrastructure Bank, you have departments responsible for social welfare. They're not necessarily truly communicating. I'll give I think a practical example. Bill made the point earlier about all these programs have different criteria, different forms, different reporting requirements. If we made government programs, and I'm talking both federal and provincial and territorial, maybe even municipal, if you introduce a kind of one-stop shopping, and we did this when the most recent accessibility legislation came into force. I worked with all the other regulatory agencies like the Transport Agency, the Human Rights Commission, and so on, to say there's no wrong door. If you call and go, I have an issue, and it had nothing to do with the CRTC, you didn't say you need to call someone else. We took care of it and forwarded it to Transport or whomever. If you could create a common database of data filed by parties when they're seeking applications, if you could make the requirements more common, you'd reduce the cost, increase the efficiency, and so on. So there are some very practical things that can be done to better coordinate. Look, at the end of the day, perhaps one broadband fund would be ideal, but that's an interesting policy discussion, because do you want it in the hands of a arm's length regulator, or do you want it in the hands of the government department that's responsible for government policy, telecom policy? And I'm sure there are good arguments on both sides. But as long as you have multiple programs, you need better coordination both within the federal government and between federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments.
You also, and on the point of between the federal and provincial and territorial governments, there are different issues there, with respect specifically to the use of transmission lines, and can you talk just briefly about that?
Sure. When you're building, again, Bill talked about I got to get permits, and I have to, if I'm trying to bury it on a hydro right of way, or string it on their towers or poles, whether they're shared with the phone company or whatever, you need permits and you need connections and you have to pay charges. Those are overseen largely in a federal perspective by the CRTC. But the CRTC doesn't regulate, for example, provincial electrical utilities. And the provinces are not going to cede jurisdiction or control over their provincial hydro companies. So again, a degree of coordination, you could change the legislation and make it clear that, for example, the federal agency or a federal agency has exclusive responsibility. But no doubt that would create a massive jurisdictional issue and conflict between federal and provincial governments. What you could do is reach agreements. And for example, I always use the Hydro-Quebec, I'm a Quebecer example, saying the government of Quebec is not going to cede any responsibility over Hydro-Quebec. But the government of Quebec and the federal government have worked closely on deploying broadband. Is it not realistic to assume they could have an agreement that says a body, perhaps the CRTC, will establish poll rates and access terms and conditions, and the government of Quebec will impose that on Hydro-Quebec? And you could work that up nationally. That kind of coordination would vastly improve the deployment, both the schedule and ease of deployment for ISPs and transport providers.
Bill, on this point, I mean, there's another layer here, which is, whether these governments, these crowns, have been consulting First Nations properly on the entire project and how it should be deployed. And you raised some interesting points about permitting and funding particular parts, but then there's a kind of overarching issue around consultation and consent. Can you talk a little bit about that and what your experience has been?
Consultation's been minimal or non-existent. I know in the past it's been, we mailed them a survey. That's been the consultation. I would encourage the funding providers to actually put some boots on the ground, go to the community that they're looking to fund or connect that are highest need, to understand the environment and why connectivity is important to these communities. Without actually being there, it's very difficult to describe. Like I could say that it's a remote rural area. It's they lack the brick and mortar facilities such as banking, simple access to a mailbox where they have to rely on the the band office or the grocery store. That's a whole other area. So have experience, boots on the ground. The permitting piece, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Well, just in terms of what you've seen about the level of consultation on, and these are big projects, right?
Yes.
On Indigenous land, and let's take the federal government, for example, or the provincial government, do you see enough conversations happening before there's announcements made about which companies are going where and so on?
In a general sense, just overarching, I'd say there definitely needs to be more consultation, needs to be more engagement with the First Nation communities. A lot of the communities are not really consulted. Like I said, here's a survey, fill it out. That's consultation. Other projects that have been by other telcos where they've actually built in parallel to our existing projects, they sent a notice to the community that, hey, we're building fiber from point A to point B. Here's a map. Here's a description. Description's vague. The map was so grainy, it's not readable. I actually sent it back saying, can you provide more detail? And nothing came back, and that was their consultation. When talking with First Nation communities, they offer consideration acceptance. The consideration requires an understanding of what's being done, what's being built. And when you're engaging the communities and say, yeah, we're going to put $10 million into this project or $5 million into this project, where those funds can be used for clean drinking water and housing, or there's a desperate need and shortage, they're looking to receive those funds to take admin fees to put towards other stuff that's needed in their communities as well. So it ties into the education piece, which for the case of Manitoba, there's Clear Sky again. So we're the mandated organization. So the communities have gotten together and provided the mandate to Clear Sky to engage their fiber builds for connectivity. So we've spent, like I said, I've been on this for over a decade now, so I have a pretty good understanding of what's needed to connect the communities and how much it's going to cost and the process to go through that. And that's taken me 10 years to get to this level. You approach a community that may have a election turnover every 2 years, which is the election cycle for the community. So you have somebody in the community that may be in the role for 2 years or less, that's perhaps never engaged with any funding model or any funding pot. And their experience with connectivity recently would be LEO. Prior to that would be some sort of terrestrial wireless, where it may be even worse than dial-up.
A LEO being a low Earth orbiting satellite. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or geostationary, like the Telesat that they use for telehealth. But without going too much into the weeds, it's to provide that, again, offer consideration acceptance. So that consideration piece is crucial for the communities to understand as to what they're getting into, what's involved, what sort of timelines to expect, and ultimately what the benefit is to the community. So to have those conversations at where the community is, to go to the community.
Thank you. So I'd love to hear your questions in the room. My colleague Clea in the back is acting as a moderator for the questions too. But you have some online, I think, Clea?
Yeah, for sure. So we've had over 100 people join us online today. So thank you so much for joining us via Zoom. The first question I will ask is on behalf of Matthias Sturm, who recently co-authored a paper with Christine Vincent-Johnson for the IRPP. So I encourage you all to check that out over at irpp.org. So Matthias says, thank you for mentioning the government's responsibility to assure affordable access to communities with low connectivity rates, especially as many services have moved to digital by default and benefits have become harder to access for many Canadians. But there's also a corporate responsibility because of services with online only or online first access that download responsibility to access services to the customer or client. Is there not a way to create incentives for companies and service providers to adopt more inclusive ways to access services and resources in addition to accessibility standards for online interfaces?
Ian?
I didn't, I had a little bit of difficulty hearing some of the question, but essentially I'd paraphrase it as saying, does the industry, do the carriers have a responsibility to connect individuals? And I think the answer is yes. I also think they have met that, not always, and perhaps not in a fully committed way that they might. But go back to the program that you mentioned earlier, Jennifer, the Connecting Families. To their credit, it was the industry that proposed that to government. And the industry even had to propose how to get over an issue of any kind of means testing, and ultimately persuaded ISED to say, well, you can use existing Revenue Canada qualifications. And they created that program voluntarily, and they expanded it voluntarily, which they deserve credit for. And there are other programs. TELUS has a program providing wireless and broadband discounted. Rogers has one. I shouldn't name individual companies, but they've done various things in various areas. My point earlier was that's not good enough. The fact that it's voluntary, not everybody participates, and that it may not be sufficient says you need government intervention. And I'm sure you could improve coordination and maybe help generalize that commitment. The last thing I'll say is they are still businesses. And we talked about the North and going 137,000 people and 2/3 of Canada's landmass. I challenge anybody in the room to figure out a business plan that will easily allow you to provide service to those communities, and be sustainable.
My colleague Blair has a microphone for anyone in the room who has a question.
Actually, I just want to add to that.
Sorry.
To add to that comment, so a lot of, sorry, I made some notes. So relying on market forces to connect to communities, well, the easy problems were solved 20 years ago. So these are not the easy problems. A lot of the low-hanging fruit's been done fairly recently. That's, under $1 million to connect a community. Now we're talking, $3+ million to connect community. When this project started, we actually developed a business case to connect all 63 communities. We've shown it's technically possible, the physical and logical network design, the financial design and the legal design to get all 63 First Nation communities on reserve population of about 150,000 in Manitoba. So we had that plan almost a decade ago now. And the challenge has been the funding. And it's the relying on market forces to get these communities connected. There's simply no business case to do it profitably. That's why we operate as a not-for-profit organization. So we've shown it is possible as a not-for-profit to sustain the infrastructure once it's built. It's just to access the grant funds to actually build it to begin with, and then we could sustain it in perpetuity. And the question was alluding to a lot of the over-top services. So you need the connectivity before you can provide those other services.
Thank you.
I had a question about the end-to-end funding process. Is there a reason why it's much easier to have nonprofits at the transit stage and less at the community ISP stage?
So the Clear Sky model, so the gateway, that's connection from major urban centers to the global internet. So there's lots of gateways, we just have to plug into it. The transit's where the challenge is. That's the part that costs millions of dollars to build the fiber. And then the last piece is the internet service provider. So the short money is with the construction. So we need the grant funds to do the actual construction piece, which we operate as not-for-profit. The long money is with the service provider. So we work with the First Nation communities to either become their own ISP. Some communities already have an existing ISP, so we just replace their wireless backhaul with fiber. They could choose to farm it out to a third party, which in that case we work with whoever the third party is. Or they do like a hybrid model where it's branded as a community ISP, but there's another ISP that in the background that switches, routers, billing system. Boots on the ground work is done by the local community. So these are major investments to get the communities connected, and how do we ensure the communities benefit from these investments economically to recycle the funds? So that's why we encourage the First Nation communities to become a local ISP. So then we work with whoever the ISP is. The difficult part's getting the initial build. And because we're not-for-profit, we're connecting multiple communities. We don't really care who the ISP is. But to connect some communities, you have to go through other communities. So so you might have to connect community A before you connect community B, community C, et cetera. So it'll be just a common infrastructure it'll just be one agreement for gateway access, and then each community would have their own ISP or some model thereof. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, perfect.
Do you want to go to the? Oh, okay. Okay, sorry.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting stuff. I'd like to know, are there any provinces that are very, very good examples of sort of getting it right with regard to the application process and the regulatory requirements for the build-out? Is there one that people say, they've been able to do it, perhaps our province and or territory could follow suit as an example? Because it seems to be that we can fix at the federal level, but then you also have to work with the provincial government for access, right-of-way, permission, licensing, et cetera.
I'm going to be a homer here. I mentioned before that I'm a Quebecer. Look, if you look at the national statistics, depending on what speed band you're looking at, Quebec and BC lead the way in terms of total connectivity. One of the reasons Quebec leads it is because early on, one, they had a provincial broadband program that was focused on providing broadband to every community in the province. They entered early on into an agreement with the federal government, and they entered into a comprehensive agreement with the federal government that was to address every single community in Quebec, and they are pretty well there. And it goes to show that with some really committed, coordinated negotiations, you can set up an agreement and implement a program successfully. Ontario has third, and they joined a little later. So I guess, again, early bird catches the worm, but I would certainly commend Quebec and the federal government for their approach.
I do know, British Columbia is another good example. The province, I believe they kicked in $40 million of seed funding early on to kickstart the project. So there have been provincial contributions across the country. Manitoba being a bit of an exception because, again, the First Nations are seen as under the federal jurisdiction, even though they're physically located within the province. So it's been challenged to access grant funds because of that.
We have another question from Zoom, and then we'll go back to the room. Phil Steinhauer Mosaico asks, in the next 3 to 5 years, what does the Government of Canada consider to be one or two of the most impactful or transferable digital literacy skills?
Alicia?
Great, thank you for the question. So obviously, basic literacy is a gateway to every other skill, right? And so typically speaking, we want to make sure that individuals have the ability to sort of naturally consume information that comes to them, whether it comes to them orally, whether it comes to them in writing, and then be able to communicate back. Once you have kind of that baseline skill, we think of it almost like a pyramid, or almost like a Django situation where you want to build on top. And so if we're looking at digital skills, if you can read and write, that immediately kind of puts you ahead, because then you can actually consume information that comes to you digitally, whether you see it on the screen, whether it comes to you through an email. Once you have that, this is where interactivity comes into it. So you're not just consuming something, but you're giving something back. You can do a survey online. You can fill out an application for a different kind of service. You can respond to a job offer that's been posted online. You know how to attach your CV. You need to file your taxes so you can get a credit so that you can do something else. So we try to layer these things on top of each other. And for different individuals, that might come in a slightly different order. So there isn't like necessarily a single path that you want people to follow. What you want is people to be aware that these are skills that they need. You want them to be able to actually access the training wherever it's located. And if there's any financial cost that's associated with that, you want to be able to actually supply that cost in some way so that you're not creating accessibility issues based on affordability or where you happen to live in the country.
Thank you. We have one in the front.
First, I would like to apologize for the preamble, but I want to give you context of the question. So I'm an executive director for Computer for School Canada. We run two main ISAT programs, the Connected Family, and we also run the Computer for School program. Those two programs is about accessibility, okay, like Ian mentioned, the issue is way beyond connectivity, okay, or accessibility, a lot of time is affordability. What we have found in the Connected Family is that I would say 65% of the people who refuse to get on board with the program is because what it's being offered is too low in terms of speed and broadband than what they really need in life, because they have 5 kids and ISP are offering bundles. So my question is there in a way that, and I don't know if it has been done before, where the federal government can look at this, not just in terms of accessibility, in terms of affordability, in terms of connectivity, but also with digital literacy? Because what we find is even if I give you a computer, you just don't know how to start it, you don't know how to navigate. And the whole digital literacy movement, there's correlation that it will increase the GDP, and more we make it accessible to the up north community. Not only do we provide them online education, health services, I think personally, the difficulty of trying to move this big puzzle is there's no concerted effort. You talk about coordination. I call this about having a national vision, national strategy, and perhaps I wasn't there when there was discussion to really see these different silos to be integrated and intertwined.
I have to say, in our work at a think tank, coordination comes up a lot when we're talking about policy challenges. That there's different players working on the same issues, but they don't, whether it's federal, provincial, territorially, or within governments. So, yes, go ahead, Bill.
Actually, there's a bit of overlap between the two questions. So around so the accessibility, the knowledge, the desire. Once you have the connectivity or adequate connectivity, how do you make use of it? Like, trying to start a business without connectivity or computers, very difficult in this day and age. You talked about, the basic use, safety. Here's some free IT training. If somebody contacts you wanting money, it's a scam. Full stop. So around just that education awareness piece, scams, viruses, break fix. So if you provide a computer, at some point, something will have to be repaired or upgraded. So providing that knowledge in the community where the people are to be able to do that work is definitely needed. But to get there, you obviously need the connectivity first, and it has to be adequate connectivity. And in my home, when my son started university, at that time we had a 50 meg internet connection. It was fine for his studies, but then COVID hit, and then trying to work from home, and it all became a problem. So we had to upgrade our connection, and we're in Winnipeg, we're in a major urban center. And we have the option to upgrade. In a lot of these communities, there's just simply no option to upgrade, or it's exorbitantly expensive to do any kind of upgrade, just because of bandwidth limitations. And then, of course, you get into overage fees, et cetera.
Maybe really one quick comment about the speeds, though, or capacity. You're quite right, and I think we found that very much during COVID. But there is sometimes an overstatement of what's needed. If you have a 200 meg service, for example, there's a lot of discussion now about everybody should have a gig. Europe is committed to a gig. The reality is in Canada, if you have fiber to the home, and over 50% of homes in Canada are already connected direct, like fiber to the home, then the amount it's irrelevant. They can provide more than a gig. But if you want a realistic target, something like 200 meg will support multiple conference calls, gaming, and so on. We don't need to have, as sometimes is called for, everybody needs a gig. You don't. It's not realistic.
In First Nation communities, as mentioned earlier, family average 1.6 kids per family. All First Nation communities are, you could have 5 to 8 people in a single home. It's actually the largest growing population, or you have multiple people in the same home. So the need for bandwidth is more as you have more people online in the single home. So the need's greater.
Alicia, I'm going to put you on the spot to wrap up, but I think there was an important message here also about economic prosperity and holding people being held back from being able to participate in all. And there's a question about coordination, and I don't expect you to be the the oracle for all of federal government on how we could do things better. But what is your observation on that question?
Yeah, well, actually, there's two questions there. And actually, I fully agree with the premise of both. So certainly, kind of the ability to access digital services, to consume them, is hugely important. In our department, one of the things that we worry most about is people who are actually eligible for things that we can offer them, who are not taking advantage of those things. They're not applying for the child benefit. They're not applying for the income supplement. Is that because they're not aware? Is it because they don't live in a community where there's a Service Canada Centre where they can just kind of walk in and demand a service? Is it because they don't have the literacy to fill in the application? Is it because they don't think it's relevant to them? Or is it because we've moved to a largely online application process and people don't have, they have to go to the library, and are you really going to go to the library to do your taxes? I wouldn't, right? So totally agree with that. I think that's one of the reasons why government have been investing in this area, because it is seen to be something that is of nature of a public good. Now, we can have different views and models as to how we do that. Do we do it through the provider? Do we do it through the individual? Does government do it directly? Is it a partnership with provinces? And all of those models have been tried in different combinations, and you probably need some of all of that, right? It's not going to be a single solution. But I completely agree with that. And that's for coordination. Look, I'd like to say that we get it completely right within the federal family. We don't. Certainly, there are always challenges around mandates that are, driven by silos. You're responsible for this. I'm responsible for that. My performance agreement is about this and not about that. We try. There are any number of governance mechanisms that kind of cross departmental mandates. Deputies get together, ministers have overlapping responsibilities, but there's always room for improvement. And then by the time you get into discussion with provincial and territorial government, that's a whole other kettle of fish. Won't get into the nature of federalism. But yeah, there's definitely models that work. The one that you mentioned, Ian, absolutely, it's a model. The things, how we work with provinces and things like apprenticeships is another model where I think it's actually been quite successful. There's other areas that are much more challenging, and they're challenging for practical reasons, for political reasons. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep trying, so we'll keep trying.
I'd like to hear that. Well, thank you. Thank you, Bill, and Alicia, and Ian, and all of you in the room for being with us today. And I want to thank TELUS. This is actually the third of a series of papers and events that we partnered with TELUS on, and I thank the TELUS team for being great partners. The program is called Imagining a Better Digital Future for Canada, and you can find the other publications on our website, and also some of the audio and video from previous events. I want to thank my colleagues from the IRPP, Blair and Clea, Ricardo back in Montreal, who helped this happen, everyone who's on Zoom participating. We encourage you to sign up for our newsletter at irpp.org if you want to find out about other events and publications. And then I wanted to highlight we're having a fall lecture at the National Arts Centre on November 25th, just about 3 weeks after the US election. And we have a speaker coming in from Johns Hopkins who's going to be great. So I'll just wanted to highlight that. And sorry to people on Zoom, but for those of you who are in the room, you're welcome to stay and have a little bit of lunch with us. And thank you very much. Merci.